Welcome to Competition Alternatives. I'm Ioannis Lianos, the founding director of the Center for Law Economics and Society at UCL and professor of global competition law and public policy. The Competition Alternatives is an initiative to promote open discussion and outside-of-the-box thinking on all areas of competition law and policy, in particular in the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The emergence of digital platforms and next-generation competition taking place between and within ecosystems raises interesting questions on the way we think about the role of competition law and the way these may interact with other regulatory alternatives. One of the areas affected by the emergence of digital platforms and intermediaries is the news media industry. More specifically, the largest digital platforms relying on an advertising revenue model have been swapping a newspaper's distribution and advertising revenues. Newspapers' revenues are declining, and many traditional news outlets face the risk of closing down. News publishers argue that as their share of the advertising revenue drops, they have less resources for investing in local and long-form creative and investigative journalism, which affects their unique contribution to democratic life. This may not only affect media plurality, but also the democratic process of which independent media form intrinsically part. Some digital platforms have put in place funds in order to subsidize content creation by independent media and investigative journalism. Furthermore, traditional media have been campaigning in order to benefit from an antitrust exemption, enabling them to collectively negotiate with the digital platforms and other digital intermediaries. Similar suggestions have been made with regard to the users of digital platforms, in particular if they contribute to the value generated by them with content and or personal data. Digital platforms and intermediaries also have a critical bearing on news and information flows and may derive significant value from news content, not only directly but also indirectly as trendsetters and public debate framers. Instead of people finding news, news find people through elaborate algorithms that are powered by social media and news feeds, search results, or recommendations. Certainly, the internet has increased the possibilities of people to contribute to the public debate by creating content and diffusing it on the cyberspace. However, the emergence of digital platforms as important gatekeepers to the internet has increased the risk of media manipulation and diffusion of fake news because of the challenge they face to suitably monitor the news content seen on their platforms. So the Center for Law Economics Society at UCL organized a conference with leading scholars and officials to discuss the challenges raised by digital platforms in competition law and policy and their relation with media and news. The first panel of the conference, which I had the pleasure to chair, explored how this next-generation competition works. Enjoy the discussion.
I would like to welcome you today to this event on Taming the Fourth Power. Question mark is, what is the fourth power? We'll probably discuss, is it the press or media, as we always thought, or is it in the process of being replaced by the digital platforms? We have a quite spectacular panel this morning and also later, this afternoon and later morning. And I will not say many things right now, but I would like to invite Jason Furman to introduce this panel. Jason is a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and he's also the chair of the expert panel on digital markets at the UK Treasury. As you may know him from his amazing work with regards to concentration. He was working for the Obama administration at the Council of Economic Advisors, and he basically started this very important debate that we are having now the last few years. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Jason today, and without further ado, Jason, please.
So Ioannis, thank you so much for including me in this conference. And I always feel like an outsider in multiple respects. I've worked on a lot of different areas of economic policy. I'm from the United States, working now on a policy issue in another country, the United Kingdom. But I came to this from the macroeconomic side, which is a set of concerns around slowing innovation, increasing inequality, and the observation that concentration is increasing in a number of sectors in the economy, at least in the U.S. economy. Concentration is not the same as less competition. Sometimes you might get more concentration because there's more competition than there used to be. I think the retail sector would arguably be an example of that. Sometimes you can get more concentration because there's less competition than there used to be. I think in the United States, the hospital sector would be a very good example of that. And then sometimes you get a really tricky sector that has aspects of both of those. In some respects, more competition, more innovation, more globalization that lead to concentration. And then, some more problematic ways in which concentration increases and can't self-correct itself. And the tech sector is an example of that. And I think in many ways that makes it one of the more challenging areas to think about public policy. I had gotten as far as that framing when the Chancellor of the Exchequer asked me if I would head a panel on digital competition. And I was really thrilled because I thought I could sort of frame a one-hand, other-hand version of the issue, but didn't quite know what that meant in terms of policy and in terms of follow-through. I think the Chancellor was genuinely open-minded and wasn't seeking a particular answer to this question, but wanted to get a range of experts together to provide advice. And then the people that we ultimately put together, including Diane, who's on this panel, Philip Marsden, who's on the next, Amelia Fletcher, and Derek Macaulay, I think came to it with that same open-minded spirit. Our terms of reference asked us to consider the potential opportunities and challenges the emerging digital economy may pose for competition and pro-competition policy, and to make recommendations on any changes that may be needed. As the terms of reference said, in particular, we'll look at the impacts of the emergence of a small number of big players in digital markets, such as social media, e-commerce, search, and online advertising. Appropriate approaches to mergers, takeovers, and anti-competitive practices in digital markets. Opportunities to enhance competition, to increase business innovation and expand consumer choice. How best to address the consumer impacts in ad-funded products and services that are, quote, free to consumers. In case you thought that was too wide a remit, the terms of reference went on to say the review will not attempt to provide answers to wider social questions, such as the possible implications of the digital economy for individuals' privacy, democracy, or independence and accountability of the media. However, it will identify the intersections between competition law, alternative policy tools, and other areas of policy. We've been working actively. We've talked to a number of people in this room. We've gotten a range of evidence that was submitted as of last week that we'll be reviewing. Some of our ideas we've written down in pencil. Some of our ideas we're still thinking about. And if you think you can figure out what any of them were from my remarks, there's sort of a 75% chance you misunderstood me and a 25% chance I messed up. So let me start with some economic propositions and some economic framing when it comes to the tech market, and then go into a few different policy areas at a relatively high level. The first part of the economics, and I don't think it's like throat clearing or should be passed over quickly, is that the digital economy has been enormously innovative and brought enormous benefits. It's created entire new categories of products, in many respects expanded choice. The quality of many of the products is quite high. The price is quite low. And in important respects, it's increased competition. If you want to start a business, the startup costs of that are lower because you have cloud computing, because you have access to platforms. Consumers can take advantage of digital comparison tools to make better choices when they shop. Multi-homing is always a possibility, and since Oliver, I'll save him from having to say it, in some cases competition may be only a click away. The question is whether all of I don't think you want to lose sight of all of that, and I think all of that is really critical. But I think in many respects, some of the normal economic forces of competition that we would count on to make results in any given market, optimal or as close to optimal, don't fully apply in this market. And the list of reasons is familiar. It varies a lot from platform to platform, from digital company to digital company. So I don't think it's any given answer. But taken together, they lead to a phenomenon of tipping, to a phenomenon of winner take most or take all on these markets. And it includes economies of scale and scope, of which data is one particularly important one. It includes network externalities, whether they're on the side of the consumer or on the side of the seller. The integration of products, services, and potentially hardware. Behavioral limitations on the part of consumers for whom defaults are very important. The economics of attention markets and the way in which those can differ from other markets, and then some of just the standard reasons why in any market you'd potentially have increasing returns to scale, like the importance of brand, which may be particularly important in a sector where trust matters a lot, and the ability to raise capital when a lot of the assets are intangible and it's hard to borrow against intangibles. So I think there's a lot of reasons to think that left entirely to its own devices, that competition won't necessarily solve every problem. There's a number of responses that are given to that approach. One is that we've thought this in the past about the massive dominant digital companies, and we've seen them unseated. Massive companies like IBM, Microsoft, and that famous titan MySpace. I don't think that should give us complete comfort for a few reasons. One is I think policy played a role in some of those transitions. The U.S. case against IBM is not an exemplar. I don't think it's what we should be aspiring to, and I'll talk more about that lasted over a dozen years. But I don't think it's totally unrelated to the shift from mainframes to PCs and the emergence of alternative hardware providers and Microsoft. The Microsoft case, I don't think is entirely unrelated to the fact that we ended up getting more competition in browsers, more operating systems, and possibly even the smartphone growing in another company, not being tied in to Microsoft. So I think to some degree those are an argument, potentially, can be an argument for action. I think a second thing is that it's important to understand that you don't want policymakers to learn the lesson that you just need to wait a little bit and the problem will solve itself. Because it's not just policymakers learning lessons. Companies are dynamic, studying these examples and learning lessons too. And I think you could argue, and I'll come back to this, that when Facebook acquired Instagram, in part it was because it looked at what happened to MySpace and was trying to learn from that and prevent it from happening to itself. So you sort of wouldn't want policymakers to learn the MySpace lesson, the only ones that learn the MySpace lesson, when companies are looking at those lessons too. Now, the third reason that I don't find these past examples fully comforting is, I'm not fully capable of looking at what's next, what's coming in the future. If I was, I'd have one of these companies rather than be with you talking about these issues today. But I sort of heard about AI and machine learning, and they seem like important things that might be an important part of our economy in the future. And who's best poised to take advantage of those? It's many of the same digital companies that are so successful today. So insofar as we can try to predict, we sort of hardware to software, software to web, web to what next. It's just as plausible that it's something that plays into the advantages of the companies as otherwise. There's another set of arguments around, this heated competition, and in cloud, in email, in platforms alike. I think we should take that seriously, and I think that's important. And I think it's important to understand sort of where there is competition, where there isn't, why in some cases you do see multi-homing and do see consumers switching, and in some cases you don't, and try to understand where that competition matters and doesn't. In terms of the downsides we'd worry about, one of it's in terms of price, and just because the price is 0 pence or 0 cents doesn't mean the price is zero. You're paying in some form, and you're paying in terms of privacy, you're paying in some respect, and so the price of that could go up. And so if Facebook acquires WhatsApp and it has less privacy protections, you could argue that means the price of using that application has gone up as a result of the merger, the acquisition. Issues of price, so it may not be price in terms of dollars and cents or pounds and pence, issues of quality, issues of choice. And then I think the most important upside and the most important downside in all of this is innovation. Google, I think, has acquired something like 300 companies. The vast majority of those acquisitions have benefited consumers. They've taken a set of talent or a product that wouldn't have worked on a standalone basis, incorporated it into a platform, improved on it, and deployed it to many more consumers. So I don't think there's anyone that would want a policy that would have gone back in time and told Google you can't buy any of those 300 companies, or even the large majority of those 300 companies. I think the debate we're having is not about the bulk of those acquisitions, but about whether there's any of those acquisitions that created some of these problems, either foreclosure problems, raising rivals' costs, reducing innovation, stemming potential competition. I think we want to look not just at market failures, which I've been talking a lot about, but government failures too. The government's at an enormous informational disadvantage. It can be subject to capture. It's not just consumers that have behavioral biases, but the government can have them too. So in crafting any policies, we want to be aware of that. And, I'd sort of summarize this economic part before turning to the policy part with sort of two propositions I think are the case. One is, the status quo in many respects is, pretty good. If we do the wrong thing, I think we could make that worse. And so it's not, any action, throw everything against the wall. You're in the middle of a crisis. You're going to try everything you can to see what works. So I think you can do a lot worse than the status quo. But I also think you can do better than the status quo for all the reasons that I said, that competition can't be fully trusted to function and bring about everything we'd want it to bring about. So I think sort of want to be smart. I think you can improve on things, but you want to be careful because I think you can make things worse. And second, I think you can do that in exactly the same way we've done competition policy for a while now, which is using evidence, thinking about the economics, focusing on consumer welfare. I think that framework is more than adequate. It just needs to be applied in a way that's relevant for this market, where you think not just about the present but the future, not just about price, but about innovation, etc. So let me now turn in my remaining few minutes to some of the policy side and just highlight three areas. The first is mergers. And I think we sort of all agree that mergers should be, more merger control should be more forward-looking, more far-sighted. I don't think this is an impossible task. When Facebook wanted to acquire Instagram, Business Insider wrote, before today, the biggest threat to Facebook wasn't Google or Twitter. It was an out-of-nowhere startup that allows people to do what they like to do on Facebook easier and faster. TechCrunch said Instagram was increasingly positioning itself as a social network in its own right, not a photo sharing app. So, venture capitalists who put prices on these companies can look forward. The companies that are acquiring them can look forward. The tech press can look forward. I think competition authorities should be able to do that too, understand how products are changing, markets are evolving. Something doesn't just affect competition in the present, but potential competition in the future. The question is, that's sort of a high-level principle. How does one go about that? And I would tell you exactly how, but I'm sorry, I only have 2 minutes, so I'll move on. The second area is antitrust. I think here's an area where there's a potential for a win-win from everyone's perspective. Whatever you think of, the European Google case, the past U.S. cases like IBM and Microsoft I could talk about, no one could think those were perfect. Too slow, too unpredictable, remedies that don't fully solve the problem. And so what can we do for everyone's sake to try to do some streamlining, to try to do some speeding up of the process, and to focus it on solving the behaviors and problems that we're trying to solve, not necessarily just notching up large fines that are good for a headline, but take so long that the market has moved on by the time you secure them. The third policy area, in some ways is sort of like the holy grail and the thing to be most excited about, which is what you can do to be, more pro-competition and more pro-entry, to give consumers more choices, to make it easier for businesses to enter. There's the famous example of telephone number portability that allowed people to switch their phone companies. What's the analog for that in these markets? To some degree, this is already happening. A number of platforms do this already. There's collaborative efforts like the Data Transfer Project going on now with Google, Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook, many other companies. GDPR requires more of this, although I think that's been done so far in an inadequate way. To move further, we have to understand what the obstacles are. Are they technical? Are they a matter of coordination? Or are they misaligned incentives where there's more incentive to do it on one party than the other? I think open banking provides an instructive example where it's some combination of all of those. There's a bunch of technical impediments. There's issues around coordination. But in that case, there were also a different set of incentives where the large banks didn't necessarily have the same incentives to have interoperability, open data that would benefit others. So understanding what we can do on pro-competition, pro-entry is the third policy area. Finally, want to conclude with sort of bringing it back to the economics by talking, with very brief comment on competitiveness. I think we need to be very mindful of that. Our project is about advising the UK about steps the UK can take. We hope it becomes a part of the broader debate. I think a little bit like you can make the status quo better or worse, you could make competitiveness worse if the UK did a set of ham-handed and mistaken actions, and you want to be quite mindful of continuing to have a great environment for startups and innovation. But I think we want to be mindful that the opposite is also true. The UK is a leader in global banking because it has excellent regulation. The UK is a great place to start a fintech company, in part because of open banking, the FCA, and the payment systems regulator. So you can improve competitiveness as well, and you can improve potentially the global environment for these policies. Some of these policies may only be feasible at a global level or only feasible in the United States. Some of them may only be desirable there. But others, I think, the UK could be a leader in, could demonstrate and be part of a conversation that Australia entered earlier this week. We'll have with our report, which is due in the first quarter. The Commission has a set of experts giving a report to them. The FTC is having a set of hearings. And I think, if we can't coordinate policy, we can at least all learn from each other to figure out how to preserve and expand on the enormous benefits that we've gotten from the sector and take advantage of, I think, the great additional potential that it still has. Thank you.
You started mentioning this winner takes most competition world where we are nowadays, which means that we are somehow stuck with very crystallized market structures that might stay there for some time. And I was wondering also if, horizontal competition challenged by other platforms in the same space is very difficult because of these network effects. And of course we can promote data access and maybe algorithm access at some point. Will actually that raise the importance maybe of what some people have called vertical competition, which we see happening quite a lot in this context. For instance, if you think about the challenge to IBM's dominance of the computer industry back in the 80s, it did not come from a hardware company, it came from basically a software company, so a complementer. And we can think of the same as well with regards to the relation between Microsoft and Google to a certain extent. And I just, to introduce a little bit the broader picture of the ecosystem that I think Annabelle has been doing quite a lot of work also with Michael Yacovidis here, in the sense that we are somehow focusing too much maybe on the horizontal competition element. If I use the Michael Porter's, let's say, 5 forces, we are focusing too much on the horizontal competition element. You might sometimes miss the broader competitive interactions happening at the vertical competition element, and in particular the transfer of value that might happen between various industries because of the fact that some players are holding a bottleneck. So Annabelle, you have been doing quite a lot of work on ecosystems and this next generation competition. So what would be your take on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Thank you. First of all, thank you, Yanis, for organizing this conference. It's a real honor to be sharing the panel with all of you, and the lineup of speakers is just tremendous. I will preface my remarks by acknowledging that even if this is a panel on competition, and the title of the conference is Competition Law, I am not a lawyer. I'm not a competition lawyer. I'm a business school professor. And I've been working over the last 20 years to develop a body of work on platforms. Platforms firms, platforms business models, platforms technologies. What does that mean? And the word platform is one of the worst misused words of today. And I would like to use the time that we have here to perhaps introduce a little bit of clarity. and perhaps to debunk a couple of myths, which I think are persistent, even in what should be rather enlightened circles. First of all, I would like to situate the situation that we are in, digital economy, in a larger historical context. We have heard reference to how the digital so-called revolution is similar in impact to the Industrial Revolution. And for sure, the industrial landscape that we have inherited in terms of firms, markets, is a direct result of a huge technological change wave that happened over 100 years ago. The concept and the form of the modern corporation, for those of you who are familiar with the work of Alfred Chandler, Scale and Scope, is a direct result of the kind of technological change that allowed better use of resources within a certain organizational form. So when we look at the automotive industry, for example, over the last century, some of the main players there, the way they became main players is that they were able to utilize economies of scale, industrialization, automation to after an era of what innovation scholars called an era of ferment, which is the beginning of every industry where lots of innovators come in and try different ways to do things, there is a consolidation as well as the emergence of what, again, innovation scholars call the dominant design, which is this is what a car looks like today. And then you start to have falling off by the sides of a lot of competitors, consolidation, and some actors become really market leaders. And then there is a question of erection of barriers to entry to structure the markets. So today, with the digital technologies, and in that word I will include connectivity, global connectivity, as well as processing power, as well as behaviors of users to willingly connect on a continuous basis, to not only consume internet-based services or digital services, but at the same time generate further data in that process of what is not anymore a pure consumption role, but a consumption as well as a generator of data. In that process, what we see are very powerful technologies. And I want to spend a couple of minutes on the word power. When we say this is a powerful technology, that could mean this is a very fast car. This is a very powerful computer. This is a very powerful search engine. And in that way, power, we think of it as something rather positive. And then we can also think of power as, oh my God, if the robots are making the decision about who's going to have access to medical care, perhaps that power is misused. Okay? And I want to spend a little bit of time explaining where does the power of platforms come from. If we want to understand the sources of power, especially if it looks like a new sources of power, we need to go back to the root of how do platforms create value. And when we speak about value, here, very soon we're going to say provide value and create value for whom. In my work, I distinguish two different kinds of platforms. What I call a transaction platforms, which by and large is what economists call multisided platforms or multisided markets. And these are companies that are going to be an intermediary between multiple sides, and we're going to talk about them as platforms when they are cross-side externalities, that is, interdependence of the demand of both sides. And we all are aware about the momentum that such network effects create. They are a self-fulfilling prophecy about success, but one of the myths that I would like to debunk is to say that every time you have a network effect, you're going to have a winner-take-all. We know very well, and there is a lot of research that demonstrates that it's actually not true. In the book that we're going to publish with Mike Cusumano from MIT and Dave Yoffe from Harvard Business School in just a couple of months, The Business of Platforms, we show that we have a sample over the last 20 years, and where we see that actually most platforms actually fail. So what we see here, we have a sample which is a survivor bias, where we see extremely successful platforms, and we don't really see that lots of platforms fail. In principle, they were all facing a situation with similar network effects. So first of all, not all platforms succeed, and then not all of them lead to a winner-take-all, because you still have niche markets, differentiation, multi-homing. And if you look just at the video game console market, you're going to see three players: Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft in that market, right? So that is, I think, important to understand. However, it is actually true that this network effect creates a huge amount of momentum, and when you start to have an install base or the users themselves that become part of your value proposition, definitely it puts a lot of wind on the sail of a platform firm. Okay? So now, if we think about the framework that we are looking at, take the competition law, right? And understandably, I think it's very right to be concerned by the increased concentration that we are looking at. When I was a young student at MIT, 94, 95, everybody was very enthusiastic and optimistic about the power of the internet to break down the old institutions, to create a flatter world, to allow everybody to have a voice, to create a less unfair world. And it is a little bit surprising, 20 years down the line, to see that, yes, we are in an economy and in a world where the creation of value is very distributed, and we all individually can create value. You can have also, a young developer in China or in India creating an app using tools and software and connecting it through an Android store or an app store from Apple and reach a very large market. So we have had an explosion of the power of innovation from all over the world, as well as generating value. However, the capture of value, so I'm contrasting value creation and value capture. However, the monetization or the financial value capture seems to be, as of today, rather concentrated in the hands of a few firms, which we call the tech giants. And when we look at, and it's a very stark number, we look at the top 10 firms in the world today, and if you want to compare them to what was 50 years ago or just even 30 years ago, on the top 10 firms in terms of market cap, we've got 7 firms who are platform firms, platform business models. 5 of them are American, 2 of them are Chinese, and none of them are European. And so we can see that the platform business model can be an extremely powerful model. So I think that I would like to expand the issue to not just competition, but competition and innovation. I would like to break open the box of the term platform and offer 2 distinct ways in which platform create value. The first one is transaction, and again, the economist model of double-sided markets is very helpful to understand how platforms create value in that way. But there is another way in which platforms create value, which is sometimes less well understood. And that's what I call an innovation platform. What an innovation platform is a technological foundation that is shared across many actors, on top of which lots of actors can innovate new products and new services. So what does that mean? You don't even have to think about digital to understand what an innovation platform is. If you think about manufacturing, and if you think about automotive manufacturing happens in a way that you have several automotive platforms which are basically product family cores. You're going to have a family hatchback, or you're going to have a mini, or you're going to have a sports. This is going to be a core set of components and an architecture. Think of it as the skeleton of a body. And every time a company creates a new car, it doesn't start from scratch. It reuses a core. So the concept of economies of scope, if you wish, economies of scope in innovation is what we're talking about here, is what an innovation platform is. Windows operating system was an innovation platform. Android is an innovation platform. iOS is an innovation platform. So what you have are companies that do innovation platforms and companies that do transaction platforms. Interestingly enough, our data shows that those companies that seem to be the most successful do both. Google has Android, which is an innovation platform, you could say, and Google Play, which is a transaction platform. Apple has iOS, which is an innovation platform. It also has the App Store. And we call them hybrids. What they do is creating value by generating and stimulating a lot of complementary innovation. The way you do that is because you open up technological interfaces and you give tools to complementors to innovate on complements. And once you have attracted to your ecosystem these innovators, then you can create these markets. I will finish with just one idea. And the idea is that I think we're moving from an economy that is not so well understood if we keep using the terms of firms and markets. I think we're moving from an economy where firms competed with each other just like a tennis player A competes with tennis player B. And a transaction between two individuals or two companies, one buyer and one seller, these were the elemental building blocks to understand how competition happened. And that happens within industries, and how you define industries was really a supply-driven concept. It's basically you and your rival who do similar things in a similar way using similar tools. We're moving away from an economy where these concepts are super useful to understand what's really going on, to an economy where the concepts of platforms and ecosystems are actually more fit for purpose to understand the behavior, which is not just competitive, but competition and innovation and the way they interact. And I think that what we need is a rigorous work trying to clarify these concepts. And that will inform, I think, policy as well as inform firms in a way that's very, very helpful. So my plea is to open up a bit, broaden up a bit the discussion. We're all experts. We've all spent dozens of years focusing our tools and being an expert. But this is a time now to talk across silos. And that's, by the way, that's how platforms create value. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. A very interesting presentation. I like that the fact that you use the concept of transaction platform. The U.S. Supreme Court is exactly the same concept in the recent Amex case, which raised quite a number of questions about what exactly it meant. I mean, from your perspective, I found quite interesting your reference to Google as being also a transactional platform to a certain extent, although some will challenge the possibility for the approach of the Supreme Court in Amex to be somehow applied as well to advertising revenue-based type of platforms, but that's definitely something important. And the other point you made, which I thought was very interesting, was the fact that there are also successes and failures in terms of platforms. I mean, we have probably remember Betamax, maybe you don't remember Betamax, or BlackBerry in a certain way, or Discover Card, which were not necessarily very successful. Oliver, you are working in one very successful platforms. So do you want to share any views about the business model and how actually that might collide with competition law to a certain extent?
Happy to. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for having me today. It's a tough act to follow, Annabelle and Jason. I think you've covered many of the points that I would make. I think, Jason, you give a very sort of balanced overview of where there may be risks, and on both sides of this, risks of over-intervention and risks of missing some issues. And Annabelle also, I think I agree with you very much certainly on the importance of terminological accuracy, a clear framing of what platforms are. Some remarks from Google's perspective, insofar as it's helpful. I think that the first thing I would say is that it is clear that there is the perception of a problem, and that is acknowledged. Social mobility is low. There is a sense that wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few. These are all very sort of real problems that are concerning people, and there's a sense that competition is not working. I think in the digital economy, people worry that a handful of large digital platforms, including Google, dominate. And there is a sense that we are, in some circumstances, blocking important technological advancements. There is also a sense, and we may come on to this later as we get into news, there's a sense that companies like Google are launching technologies that are extremely disruptive and that have a negative impact on society. The question is really, how do we create rules that motivate the sorts of innovations and advancements that are best for consumers, put most simply? And I think, as I mentioned, the first jumping off point for me is certainly how does one define the platform. The term platform is perhaps rather unhelpful insofar as it, from our perspective at least, is very generic. We look at our industry, we see sort of Apple providing a platform of sorts insofar as they are a hardware, typically thought of as a hardware platform and an app store platform. Facebook, of course, is a social network that connects friends and family. We are primarily thought of as a search engine, a search platform. Amazon is both retailer and marketplace. Netflix, content creator, an entertainment platform. So I think my first observation would be that when talking about platforms, it's very important that we have a clear set of terms, a terminology, and a very clear statement of the problem that we're trying to address. I also think that, and Jason mentioned this in his opening remarks, that it's important to be sure that when we think there is a problem, that we are interpreting the evidence properly. As you say, consolidation, concentration may well be a consequence of competition on the merits. When we look at our industry, there are signs that the industry is competitive. There are high degrees of investment in R&D, in tech. 4 out of the top 8 spenders in global R&D are online companies, which seems to be a sign of competitiveness. There are high degrees of innovation, fast product cycles. We've touched on several of them already. You see that in retail, you see that in transportation, you see that in video streaming, photography, various areas where there are very high degrees of innovation. And in the midst of that, we're actually seeing a fair degree of competition between platforms. So when you think about something like music, you see Apple competing with Google, competing with Spotify, competing with Facebook increasingly. Video streaming is another good example of Netflix competing with Amazon, competing with Google, competing with Sky. So we do see a high degree of competition between the platforms. And low prices, low or close to zero prices for consumers, taking Jason's point that there may be more to the price than simply a fee that is charged, but the prices are nevertheless, the financial prices are low for consumers typically. Where there are arguments around the nature of increasing markups, which is often something that's referred to in this context, that may well be a consequence of costs being driven down by highly effective, efficient companies finding new technological ways of doing particular lines of business. All that being said, I do agree that concentration may in some circumstances be a consequence of rather troubling causes. Networks do tip, that is true. And then we find ourselves in a situation where consumers, users are staying on the network, not because they want to, but because of the inertia that's created around the size of the network, essentially. We see IP rights being abused. There may be a refusal to supply a competitive asset, which may well be a data set. That's absolutely conceivable. And non-competes are something that can have an impact on the ability of important employees to switch to competing services. So there are these artificial barriers out there, we acknowledge that. I think that the question that flows from that, for me at least, is what kind of intervention best avoids or reduces the risk of those kinds of artificial barriers. A friend of mine recently told me that one of the best motivators for pro-competitive conduct is that it makes commercial sense. And that's quite true. So in the shopping appeal, for example, Google takes the position that the opportunity space of the search results that's involved in that case, that was used for showing shopping ads, we made it's such expensive real estate for us commercially that it only made business sense for us to make changes there when it improved our search results. So there are circumstances, I believe, where the business imperative will direct companies in a way that will avoid some of these barriers. Similarly, on data portability and privacy, these are important to Google because it is important to consumers, to be very frank. Google Takeout, the data transfer project that was mentioned earlier, privacy dashboards, these are all things that consumers expect and demand from Google, and that's why they're now provided. And my sense is that as consumers become more aware of the use of data and the options that are there, they will become more demanding, and that will inevitably lead to improvements. In addition, there are various regulations. So GDPR tells us how we ought to treat users' data. Copyright, and increasingly copyright reform, tells us how we ought to be treating content and the rights of content owners. And platform regulation, in its current form, or the form it looks like it will adopt in the future, will focus on transparency. How ought we to be telling consumers about the decisions that we're making? What processes for appeal should we provide to people when we make a decision that affects them? Competition law, of course, acts as a complement, sits in that framework of other laws, GDPR, platform regulation, etc. Just very quickly, I'll touch on a couple of the points that have already been made, but I've worked on one of the cases, so I have some experience. Delay, I often hear this shopping case, it took the best part of 8 years. How is that effective, Ollie? My personal view, the delay there was not typical, I would say. I mean, there were some specific moments in that case that were rather unique in my view. We did engage in commitments for some period of time during the case. We had an agreement with DG Comp. We then moved in a different direction. So that did, I think there was a very specific set of circumstances that led to the delay there. But it is clear, I think, that these cases involving companies like mine do involve a high degree of research, great volumes of data, and the teams working on those cases could be better resourced, and I think that would accelerate some of the processes. And in some circumstances, interim relief may be appropriate. It's available. It is an option. There's a high threshold, but that could be deployed to accelerate some of these processes. Very quickly on the killer acquisitions point, which is often made. The sense that we are missing some killer acquisitions. There are some acquisitions where typically an American company spots a potential competitor and snuffs them out. I think widening the aperture of merger control seems like a perfectly sensible thing to consider. That will be costly for companies like Google. It will be costly for the target companies, and it will be costly for the agencies who are engaged in those inquiries. So I think as a sort of a starting point for that type of analysis, one would want to make sure that we have conducted rigorous retrospectives to try and identify some of the moments when that happened. I think that for me would be the starting point for that kind of process. So beyond the specific concerns that I've just touched on very briefly there of cases taking too long or merger control missing some killer acquisitions, I must say that the grounds for new rules in digital markets are not entirely clear to me. I think that the analysis in digital cases may well pose some specific challenges. Market shares may be more or less useful. The SNP test may be rather difficult to apply in some circumstances, zero price markets, for example. But I don't think that we require that those kinds of issues require a fundamental rethink of the competition rules. We just need to deploy analytical tools that are currently available in rather case-specific ways based on the facts. And I do think that there may be some dangers to rushing to substantially revise or change antitrust rules to cater for a particular category of digital case. For one thing, as we've already touched on several times here, it may be rather difficult to define a platform. That will come with some challenges, and it will therefore be rather difficult to know who's in and who's out, who will this affect and who will it not. I know that's been a challenge in platform regulation, for example. And finally, there is a question of, speaking as an in-house lawyer, the question of legal certainty is important to us. We ought to know, within reason, whether we are on the right or the wrong side of the law. So it will be very important for any more rules, I'm out of time here, to be sufficiently specific for us to apply them on a day-to-day basis in our decision making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Very interesting remarks. And you introduced pretty well also the topic of the overall discussion today in terms of the relation between these platforms and particularly the media industry. So we have here the pleasure to have Diane Cole, who's a professor at the University of Cambridge. She has an extensive experience of the media industry, being before the BBC Trust. And also she's a member of the expert panel on digital markets. Diane, any thoughts to share on this?
Thank you very much, and for the invitation to take part today. So I am a member of Jason's panel, but these are my personal views. He doesn't necessarily agree with me, much as I encourage him to do so most of the time. So Jason's a macroeconomist, I'm a microeconomist, and I've been looking at digital markets for about 20 years now. I was on the Competition Commission in the 2000s, so that ended in 2009. But even then, we had digital questions affecting some of the inquiries that I was involved in. One of them was the merger of Waterstones and Ottakar's, two high street bookstores, where they forcefully made the argument that Amazon was increasingly strong competition for them in book retail, and we accepted that argument and allowed that merger to go ahead. Another one I was involved in was the merger of Game and Game Station, two high street games shops, and there too there's clearly online competition in games and online game playing starting as well at the time. And a question there about second-hand games, because they were the only two refurbishers and retailers of second-hand games. This was in 2006 and 2007, so we were aware of two-sided market models, but that hadn't yet been translated into everyday competition practice. So this was now 10 years ago, and you might say it's about time that the competition policy community is starting to get its head round how to have the practical tools and methodologies for handling digital markets. And I think one of the things that the digital technology highlights is a long-standing weakness in competition economics and the analysis, which is that it's mainly static. And we've never had a really good way of thinking about the dynamic costs and benefits of mergers or dominance in markets. So for sure this is difficult, but as Jason was alluding to in his remarks, other people seem to manage to think about this, so maybe the competition authorities need to think about this as well. Because the point about focusing only on the static aspects of these markets is that the benefits of digital are enormous. We had no broadband yesterday when I was working at home trying to finish a paper, and I can tell you, I really felt the pain. I'm in the middle of some research at the moment looking at contingent valuations, willingness to pay and willingness to accept survey evidence on how much value people around the country ascribe to free digital products they don't have to pay money for. And the answer is they are giving extraordinarily large numbers. They don't have to pay this money, so you take the evidence with a grain of salt, but essentially what the evidence so far is saying to us is that there is no amount of money people would accept to give up Facebook for a month or similar products. And there's a social gradient to that as well, and the people who have least money and least education and so on, people in more remote parts of the country ascribe even more value to access to these products. And you have to take that kind of evidence very seriously. So this is very preliminary, but it's consistent with work Erik Brynjolfsson and colleagues at MIT have found in the United States as well. So these benefits, these static benefits, are large indeed. So the question then is about how you understand the dynamics. And is it really the case, as I've heard people, colleagues of Oliver's from Google say, that innovative rivals really could enter these so-called GAFA markets and overturn the incumbents with a better technology? Do executives at Google really lose sleep over this possibility? So Oliver referred to the very large R&D spend that they undertake, which is certainly true. I would also like to see the evidence from their smart watches about how much sleep they're losing over it, I have to say. We might be more sceptical with hindsight about some of the acquisitions, and I think that kind of retrospective look at some of those acquisitions and what the counterfactuals might be would be difficult, but would be worth trying to do. It does seem to me pretty clear that in some of the upstream markets that I know most about, that the presence of Facebook and Google to such large scale in online advertising markets and the growth in online advertising really have reduced innovation in the rest of the news industry. And I think it's really hard to argue against that, with all kinds of externalities associated with that. So for me, actually the advertising market is at the heart of some of the issues that we would be most concerned about, not only from an economic perspective. There is a very large market share of online advertising going to companies. The market itself is complex and not entirely transparent. there's quite a lot of evidence it's being driven by bots and so on, and that the need to get advertising clicks is driving quite a lot of behaviour that might concern us not as economists. I think we also need to understand the shadow value of time. There's no monetary cost to a lot of services that people value greatly in the digital space, but there is a time cost to it. So I'm also doing some work with Lenin Nakamura at the Philadelphia Fed, trying to understand how much time people are spending, but also what the value of that time is and what the opportunity cost of that time is in an economic sense. So I think probably there's a broad consensus now that some kinds of policy interventions in these markets are needed, but I have some cautions about it. Not only that there's very great value that consumers attach to the services that they're able to access. One is about defining what you're talking about. And we've already heard Annabelle and Oliver talk about the definition of platforms and being careful about that. People talk about the digital economy. To me, this makes no sense because it's like talking about the electricity economy. It's all digital. And anything that one does in terms of intervention affecting technology companies, you're going to have to think about what the effects are going to be on the rest of the economy. It will sweep a lot up in its net. Another is that it's not the business of regulators to adjudicate on particular business models. Platform models have very large economic benefits in some cases, including in the case of Annabelle's innovation platforms, reducing entry costs for other startups. There's clearly, in some markets or some niches, special pleading by incumbents. So where there are some very large digital companies entering those markets, undertaking some regulatory arbitrage, actually that's pro-competitive behaviour in my book. You might not like the companies, but they're enhancing competition. And finally, you wouldn't want to introduce a regulatory burden that's penalising everybody for a small number of behaviours that aren't really to do with competition. So the panel's focused on competition policy, competition law and economics. And you can't use that to tackle all the problems that people are talking about in this domain. And there might be other areas to look at alongside it, like consumer regulation and corporate governance. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for also being very much on time. You raised a quite interesting issue about missing markets in this context that we have, that might lead to maybe some bigger institutional reforms in terms of property rights, maybe for data or attention time. And also the concept of power that I think is extremely important in this context, and we have difficulties to identify probably the sources of power of these digital platforms. Justus has done quite a lot of work for the German Ministry of Economics, a report that he published recently, co-authored with a number of colleagues like Heike Schweitzer and Wolfgang Kerber, that focuses a lot on this concept of power, and you had some quite interesting suggestions there. Just would you like to share a little bit of thoughts?
Yeah, thanks very much. Also, pleasure to be here and try to add some insights that we gained from our report that we published I think in September actually, for the German government, that was dealing more or less with the question of what do we need to do with competition law for the next competition law reform that we will probably see next year or the year after in Germany. And let me start with the observation that, as some of my colleagues have already mentioned, there are more or less two issues that characterize the, however we call it, digital economy or the economy of today, let's say, that have always been there, but that are more important today than they have been in the past. One is network effects, and the other one is the use of data. Of course, it had always been there. Yeah, you will never be able to run a business without data. So even in medieval times, you probably tried to figure out what your consumers wanted and try to serve them. So you use data in some sense, but of course we use a lot of more data today than 500 years ago. So this is one of the differences, but let me start with the network effects. As Jason already mentioned, and Diane and Annabelle also said, a particular characteristic of the platform economy or of platforms or some platforms are that they can be winner-take-all markets. They don't need to be, but they can be winner-take-all markets because of the strong network effects. And I think it makes sense to differentiate a little bit further and ask, where do the network effects directly come from? Are they actually, let's say, transaction or more generally, let's say, activity-based of some sort? Do other people benefit from activity taking place on another platform? Or do they rather stem from the availability of other members? Let's say on a shopping platform, you may not be interested whether there is so much activity, you just want to have choice. So you want to have a lot of shops or offers that are being available in principle, whether you not shop with all of them. Or let's say on a dating platform, you are probably more interested in the availability of choice than the activity level in some sense. If it's more based on the availability, I think there's the perspective that we can have competing platforms that it's much brighter actually, because in that case multi-homing is easier than in the case of activity-based. Even with activities, of course, you can be active on many platforms, but as Diane mentioned, time is limited. It's much more difficult to be active in parallel on many platforms. Of course, we as academics know we tend to post our new papers on many platforms, but at the same time, but it's burdensome. Sometimes the availability is easier in some sense. Yeah, let's say if you open a shop on Amazon and you open another shop on eBay and another outlet on some other platform, that's in some sense much easier. You just have to make clear that you are there in that sense. And in these particular markets where it's based on availability, multi-homing is particularly important, of course, because in theory, and that differs from other network industries that we have had in the past, you can have both competition and the entire network effects. You could have, in theory, let's say, all the shops of the world being on Amazon Marketplace, and at the same time, all the shops of the world being on eBay. And you could also have all the shoppers, all the buyers being on eBay and Amazon at the same time. And there's also a difference because to other more traditional markets, because let's say electricity, for example, if you wanted to switch, you really would need to cancel your contract and switch over to a new provider. So it's some switching costs, and you couldn't multi-home in any meaningful sense, really. You couldn't be with two electricity companies. And most people found it too burdensome to be with two telephone companies. In theory, of course, you could have two mobile phones, but people didn't prefer to have two mobile phones. So it was too burdensome, so they didn't multi-home. In these markets where it's based on the availability, multi-homing is quite essential. And it's if the cost of multi-homing is low per se, we should be very careful if firms in these markets that may be tipping try to think about strategies how to tip the market, how to make multi-homing more burdensome for either buyer or sellers on these or the two different sides of the market. And there was one aspect of the report that we said maybe we need some more, let's say, shades of grey in competition. Or typically we look at something like dominance or not. And our suggestion here is German competition law is somewhat special. We already have more shades of grey in the sense that we have the concept of relative market power, which is a level below dominance. Actually, and say if you are not dominant but enjoy relative market power, certain types of practices are not allowed for you, while other things may still be allowed that only become sort of disallowed once you become dominant in a market. So it's more like, say, stepwise approach, where only certain practices are covered for firms that are relatively dominant. And our suggestion in the report, one of the suggestions is, shouldn't we use this particular threshold of relative market power and say if firms engage in practices that may, for strategic reasons, without, let's say, any objective justification, burden sort of proof being put on the firms in that case, if they make the multi-homing more difficult than it needs to be, then it should be disallowed for firms that enjoy relative market power. So somehow, for this particular practice, lower the threshold, but not across the board. A second point that we were looking at, and I think that has some relation to actually media companies more, is the relationship between market power and information asymmetries. Typically in economics, we have thought about these as being sort of two separate types of market failure. Either there's information asymmetries, and this may result in market failure, and we need to have some remedies to address this. And if there's market power, we need some sort of different remedy to address this type of market failure. But in these particular, let's say, certain type of platforms, and I think here especially about these comparison platforms, and thereby it also has some resemblance, of course, to Google Shopping in this particular case. Market power and information asymmetry may go hand in hand. In the extreme case, let's say, if there would be only one comparison platform, where you can compare, let's say, hotels, electricity prices, whatever, of course, it's very difficult for the users to find out whether this is a biased ranking or not, because there's no other place to compare the ranking to, actually. So when I was working on electricity price comparison platforms, we saw a strategy actually that some of the companies were putting up many comparison sites using exactly the same database, being owned by the very same company, looking totally different. Of course, with the idea, well, consumers will in the end up look at 3 different platforms, think they have looked up into 3 different platforms, and didn't realize they've looked up the same database 3 times, basically. In that way, this creates an information asymmetry that creates market power, and sometimes allows you to bias rankings if you wish to. And of course, then the more difficult question becomes, what are remedies that we can deal with? So it's not only a consumer protection issue, but also it allows you to extend your market power probably into other areas. And transparency was already mentioned, maybe an important remedy in this particular case. One you've looked up the same database 3 times now. 3 more minutes. So very shortly. We also talk about merger control briefly in the report, saying, of course, we've talked about this very briefly already, that there were these 300 plus acquisitions, and shouldn't we do anything about it? And we say, yes, there's probably a need to be more careful. Tommaso Valetti, who's speaking later today, made the suggestion last week, I think, that we look at markets for attention in order to capture mergers that we haven't captured in the past, because thinking about something like WhatsApp, Facebook may be looked upon as different markets, but if we think it's a market for attention, they would have been the same market. The problem, of course, is if we look into the market for attention, app use cases may be more difficult, actually. The German cartel office is looking into Facebook from an app use perspective, and you say it's really not a market for social network, it's a market for attention. Of course, then the question is anybody actually dominant in a market for attention? It's somehow seems to me when the lottery once came to us and said we are not a monopoly, and we asked them why, because we compete for consumers' money. So it's sometimes it can become very broad in the end. One last point, if I'm allowed.
Sure, of course.
But still, I think sort of allowing competition agencies to look onto the broader strategy, may be a good idea, even though that brings about some other difficulties we are fully aware of. Last point, data access. It often has been said that data is like oil, and probably more often it has been said now that data is not like oil. But it hasn't been said that often that data is not like railroad bridges. Why do I say data is not like railroad bridges? Because there's a question, can data be an essential facility? And of course we can think about that access to some part of data may be almost necessary in order to compete in the market. Of course, not all types of data. We have to differentiate. And here, the difference between railroad bridges and data is that, railroad bridges or other physical infrastructure, let's say local loop unbundling, is at least at some point rival in consumption. There are capacity limits, typically. Data is not always rival in consumption. Most of the time it's not rival in consumption, actually. Which means even if you grant somebody else access to your data, you still can use the data. And secondly, sometimes it's very costly to invest into gathering the data. But it's not always the case. Yeah, sometimes data is generated as a byproduct, let's say. And these are two reasons why I think the general threshold should be lowered in some circumstances. The threshold should be lower from under which competitors can get access to data, because it's not rival, unlike physical infrastructure, and it's not always as costly to maintain or to invest into. This is not true for all types of data, I'm fully aware, but we should be differentiate. At the moment, the threshold for granting access to essential facilities is for very good reason quite high, actually, under legal standards. But for data, I think, as for some types of data, on a case-by-case basis, it should be lower, actually, to facilitate competition. I'm over my time.
So thank you very much, Justus. Very interesting, actually, the additional source of power that you mentioned, this informational asymmetry that can be a source of power, of intermediary power, if I use correctly the term that you use in your report, which adds a little bit to the source of power that Annabelle mentioned, this coming from architectural advantage in a way, from being basically very central in the architecture. Now we have talked a little bit about the broader picture of digital platforms, not so much touch about the news and media platforms interaction. Maybe Damien could be our missing link with the next panel. So Damien, any thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much, Yanis. Delighted to be here, and delighted that my boutique firm is supporting the event. I should start by saying that I love newspapers. I've always loved them, and as I get older, I love them more. I have multiple subscriptions because I think one should pay for access. But I'm worried about the future of newspapers. I always like to take this example. Think of a company whose quality has increased tremendously. Where the readership has increased tremendously, where the output has increased tremendously, where innovation has increased tremendously. And that company, could be The Guardian, for example, but it could be also many other newspapers. And yet, The Guardian has been losing money for quite some time. I'm hearing that they're doing better, but they've been reduced to solicit donations. And I fear that in many countries, the leading papers will be either begging for money or will be owned by extremely wealthy people. And I'm not sure that is what we want. When it comes to smaller newspapers, the situation is even more disastrous. I've done some work for federations of newspapers in some member states, and local papers are basically dying one after the other. Again, is this what we want? Now, you will tell me, what does it have to do with competition law? If newspapers fail, it's just because they've got an outdated business model. It's because they were unable to adapt to the digital economy. It's just because they're a bunch of losers. And I disagree with that. I think that there is a significant competition problem or significant competition problems. Let me try to explain why. And I think I should start by explaining the business models of newspapers. So there are essentially two sources of revenues. One is subscription fees, and this is why several newspapers have paywalls in order to incentivize people to subscribe. And then you've got advertising revenues, and often both. So, for example, the New York Times is generating about 2/3 of its revenues from subscription and 1/3 from online advertising. Now, there is a clash, and a serious one, between digital platforms and newspapers, because newspapers, they're looking for subscribers, and they want also people to visit their websites or to visit their apps in order to get more data and be able to monetize their content. Whereas the digital platforms, they like free access, and they want you to spend time on their ecosystem. And of course, then you've got a sort of conflict between the two. In the rest of my presentation, I will pick a bit on Google, and I'm sorry because Oliver is in the panel and he's a very nice person, but I'm afraid that it's hard not to pick on Google if you want to illustrate some of my concerns. So let's start by looking at subscription revenues. So for years, digital platforms have tried to weaken newspapers' paywalls. For example, Google had a so-called first click-free policy, whereby unless online newspapers accepted to give Google users access to 3 to 5 free articles per day, and it meant, per device and per browser, by the way, these newspapers would not be indexed in Google and therefore would just basically fall into oblivion. That created significant harm to newspapers, and it's only recently, after significant pressure from the papers and possibly from competition authorities, that this policy has been abandoned. Let me give you another example. While Google was abandoning the first click-free policy, it came up with AMP. So what's AMP? Well, AMP is a streamlined format for mobile pages, apparently designed to allow these pages to load faster on mobile devices. Now, the problem with it is that all these AMP pages have to be loaded on Google servers, right? So the pages are not on the newspaper servers, but they are on Google servers, which allows Google to collect all the user data interaction between readers and content, and the papers to get none of it. The second problem is that these pages are harder to monetize for newspapers. And of course you might say, well, the newspapers don't have to actually use the AMP format. Well, they do have to use it, because if they don't, they're actually not, their stories will not be shown on the Android news carousel, which is what you get if you actually do a search and on your Android device. So the growth in AMP pages has been spectacular because newspapers didn't have much of a choice. Now let me turn to the second part of my presentation, which relates to advertising revenues. And again, The Guardian, stated after doing some experiments that they seem to be getting as little as 30% of the sums paid by advertisers for their online ads. So that means that 70% of the money would go to intermediaries. I've seen worse figures. For example, yesterday someone sent me an email saying that in fact I was wrong. It's more 25%. Other sources say 35% or 40% or 45%. It's not entirely clear. But it seems that a lot of money is going to intermediaries. So over the last 4 months, I spent quite a bit of my time looking into this issue because I really wanted to understand what was happening between an advertiser like, for example, Nike shoes, Nike, which wanted to, have ads on, for example, online newspapers and was willing to pay for it, and then the publishers, right? Yes, 3 more minutes. I'll be done in 3 minutes. I just found out that this, what goes on between advertisers and publishers is of mind-boggling complexity. And I was absolutely astonished. And to some extent, I admire the technological prowesses of these intermediaries, because what's happening, for example, if you're an advertiser like a small company and putting some money or bidding some money on AdWords, right, is that you will have a first auction in AdWords, and then there will be a second auction in an ad exchange, and then there will be a third auction in DFB. And so so when you sort of analyze the matter, you see that there are many opportunities for intermediaries, and the biggest one is Google, of course, to basically take advantage of these processes. I summarized all of that in a paper that I posted on SSRN 2 days ago. It's called, I think, Competition Analysis of online display advertising in the programmatic era. It's not a very good seller as a title, I would say. but read it. You'll find it interesting. Where my co-author and I really try to unpack the sort of technological complexity to make it accessible to lawyers, and we explain that there are a number of conducts that might fall or that might be a source of concerns under competition law. There's a bit of tying. There's quite a bit of self-preferencing, interestingly enough. And there are also possibilities for arbitrage, because we found out that when you have consecutive second price auctions, the company running these auctions can actually pocket quite a bit of the money. And so that's what our paper is about, and I hope that at least some of you will look into it. And I hope that I tried to, I was sort of, I convinced you that some of the problems faced by online newspapers are actually linked to competition problems.
Thank you very much, Damien. I also appreciate the fact that you mentioned you have been also working for media companies in this context. I think disclosure is extremely important. And before giving the possibility to Oliver to respond, let me say that I really like this emphasis you put on the process of vertical competition that's happening here for the surplus value, basically, between the digital platforms and the media companies. I think this is something that we see happening in many other industries. The question is if this value capture is an issue for competition law, or because it raises the issue of fairness, as being an important aspect of competition law or not. And I guess there are many different views there.
Your concerns around the first click free policy. To be clear about what that was intended to achieve, the notion there, which seems reasonable to me, was that users, certainly from my own perspective, that users were interested when clicking on a search result that you're taking to content that you can read. That was the intuition there. And then it would make sense to give people who click on your search results some of the contents they have an understanding of what the website offers. That was what First Click Free was about. It wasn't about forcing people to give access to content. It was about letting publishers know that users were interested in the content. Why did we move away from it? Well, not pressure from regulators. We moved away from it as a consequence of discussions with your client, I think, primarily, News Corp. And they were very interested in new models for providing a combination of paywall access and transparency for users who were interested in seeing what was on the site. It's a model known as flexible sampling. And by the way, we help your client and many others with their analysis of how they can adjust their business models to deal with what is a very disruptive technology, the internet and search engines. We'll be investing 300 million, I think, in the next 3 years to help people create and experiment with new paywall models and new types of online news businesses. AMP. First of all, I think it's important to be clear about what AMP is, what the acronym stands for, because people may not know. It stands for Accelerated Mobile Pages. The notion there was that for people on mobile devices, it is frustrating when you click on a link and you have to stare at the blue bar filling as you wait for the content to appear. Wouldn't it be better if content could appear instantaneously? And that was the reason for the AMP project. It's an open source project. It's one of several. We thought that was a good thing for consumers. It does allow for advertising. There is an initiative known as AMP Ad that you should look at there if you'd like to know more about that. The point you made about access to AMP being a precondition to prominence in the search results is also a touch simplistic. Prominence in the search results is a consequence of the speed of load. So pages that do load quickly, we consider them to be more useful to users, and they achieve more prominence in the search results. Use of AMP is not a precondition to prominence in the search results. very, very quickly. On advertising, I understand it's a complicated setup. I agree with you there. Insofar as I can help you, you should let me know what your questions are. On the share of revenue, I can help there also. 70% of revenue on average that is generated via ads on Google goes directly back to the publishers. So in 2017, we sent some 12.5, 13 billion of revenue back to our publishers. That's my point.
Because what Apple would absolutely love to do is to tell you, don't bother, and I'm going to do what I do and what Google does, by the way, which is to make sure that you have a comfortable life. Now, you have a comfortable life, but I am going to be the one that is going to be commoditizing anyone else in the chain. I'm going to tell you that as you roam around, I will be looking at who is the mobile provider with the cheapest phone. So yes, users, we would have a number of phones. If they were able to overturn, Nokia actually was the first one to resist when they started having this fight of SIM-less versus SIM having a card or not, which would then mean that you would have the provider of the device that would be able to essentially say, I'm going to have a lovely program that's going to be swapping around all these different types of mobile telephony providers. As a result, I will be able to say, I bring value to the customer, but at the same time, I do a significant reorganization of who keeps the upsides and the downsides. Now, why is this relevant? It is relevant because this has been sorted in essentially a non-regulated context, i.e. the battle was waged, eventually they didn't manage to do that, and the status quo was preserved. There is an equivalent story with the mobile payments that stalled about 7-8 years ago because some of the key players did not want to be challenged. That was pushed along. Why is this relevant for us from a regulatory perspective? Because the questions of the rules and roles of engagements, which is, I guess, when we coined this term, industry architectures wanted to bring up, is becoming increasingly relevant in terms of who will capture the benefit from broader swathes of value. And I think that should enter the regulatory purview because we are increasingly in the context of being able to redesign it. My concern is, with my fellow economist, former economist myself, I consider myself more of a strategy guy nowadays, that we still use the arsenal that is a little bit outdated because we consider one market at a time, we consider issues of dominance, and sometimes in network markets, we consider network externalities. When most of the issues that are going on right now, including with the platforms, whether it's Google, whether it's Amazon, whether it is Alibaba, have to do with the ability in which they are transforming sectors. And if you go to speak with people in the strategy team of all of these firms, the question is, how do I manage to maximize the value that I create for the customers, yes, but capture for myself by making sure that I can take value from other sectors. So the question and the challenge that I would have for the panel is what can we do to update the way that we comprehend the way that the economy is structured, the vertical dimension that you mentioned a moment ago, Jan.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I'm Sally Bratmuso. I'm from the University of East Anglia. And I've also been looking into these advertising markets. So my first question would be to Oliver, what part of Google is it that gives 70% back? Is it the Google marketing platform that the agencies are using and the big advertisers, or the AdSense AdWords that the small guys are using? Is it in relation to the rev share that they're getting when they put content on YouTube, for instance, and their ads are sold around that content? So which part of it is doing that? Because I've heard these similar kinds of stories. The other thing is, arbitrage has been part of advertising for a long time. That's agent media buyers been doing, but it's been somewhat transparent because of rev shares and stuff, systems, not rev share, but share-based trading systems for broadcasting and stuff. And I'm wondering now, with so much of it becoming complex in these various levels of auctions, is there anything that we should be looking at in financial industries in terms of how to handle those essentially arbitrage systems that are going on in the programmatic?
Thank you. The question there, yes?
Yeah, this is also for Oliver. The French Competition Authority, in their report on the advertising industry, indicated that media gets back generally 40% on average. And they have a various breakouts. So and you mentioned 70%, that's quite a large difference. Were they just wrong, or was there some nuance that they missed?
So that was Maurice. Excellent, thank you. So we have a number of questions, and what I would like to do is maybe also give the opportunity to the speakers to make some final remarks. I think we touched upon a number of points. I noted down three important issues that I think we discussed. So the first is the winner takes most world. And we might have different implications from a macro perspective or from a micro perspective on what could be this winner takes most world. And in particular, we haven't touched upon the role of financial markets, because the value that these companies actually have, the market value of these companies, is very much based on financial markets valuation. And this market valuation comes out of expectations about future profits, future basically bottlenecks, rather than current profits. And many of these companies actually are not even profitable. I'm thinking about Amazon for a long period of time, or Uber. So is this really something that to take into account in our equation? I mean, in the way we think about the winner takes most competition world. Secondly, some of us focus quite a lot on this idea of vertical competition and capture of value, and there have been some concerns about the usual framework of competition, not to focus on relevant markets. Maybe we are missing a picture there. Should we move towards integrating what I've been suggesting in my writings about the value chain approach? Is it really something that competition should care about, this capture of value? And the third thing is about the concept of the threshold of intervention of competition, and in particular the idea that for competition to intervene, there should be some exercise of power, some abuse of power. And the question then is, how can we define this power that has to generate intervention? And we heard different stories. I mean, we heard a kind of a broader perspective on power that comes out of asymmetry of information or an intermediary role. Maybe the focusing on dominant position might not be enough. Relative dominance might be an important aspect to take into account, relative market power. And then this idea of architectural advantage or being the main architect of a specific industry, which could probably provide some power. Is this something that we can integrate into our competitional thinking? So these are some points. So what I would like to ask you is maybe to choose which of the three of the points that were made, the questions that were made by the audience, you'd like to discuss, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss everything. So we have, let's say, 15 minutes. So please, Jason, starting with you.
Great. Well, I thought everyone's comments were great, even when they disagreed with each other. And I guess a few things is sort of threshold of intervention. I think predictability matters a lot there, and I think Oliver said this. I think it's completely reasonable to say we want to know what we can do and what we can't do. And the clearer you are about that, in some sense, lower your threshold of intervention can be, because you clearly said you can't do that, so of course you can intervene. So I think the clarity of those rules and the threshold of intervention are very much related. Then the question is, how can you have clearer rules in a world where things are evolving quickly and changing quickly? So, Oliver, I think quite reasonably wants clear rules, but, you can have some clear rules that are really stupid and that don't work as things change and evolve over time. So, how do you then handle that trade-off between flexibility and dynamism you need and clarity? Some of that may be that you don't, that you don't do everything through a competition, antitrust, ex post type of manner. Some of that may mean, when you combine the changing with the industry's knowledge, raise issues of co-regulation, raise issues, possibilities of participatory antitrust, and the like. So I think figuring out how to have as much clarity as possible, but recognizing some of the tension between that clarity and, the flexibility and dynamism. So that was just sort of listening to all of this. One point I wanted to make. The second point I'd want to make is, that I think a lot of innovation is based on what's good for consumers, and you make money by delivering things that are good for consumers. But you also make more money by having, fewer rivals and less competition, and you can see innovation in, both of those ways. Consumers are decent at choosing. I don't think we should think they're terrible. But it's not just regulators that think consumers aren't always great at making choices. When Google chooses to pay to have itself as the default search engine in Safari, it's putting a lot of money behind the proposition that it thinks consumers are not making a complete de novo choice every time they go into search. And so I think in some sense, we need to understand the same things that the companies themselves understand as they undertake their practices. The last thing I'd say is that, sort of when you're thinking about some of the regulatory issues, GDPR, has come up a number of times. It's important to sort of understand whether you're coming at something from, a human rights universal perspective, and you shouldn't be able to violate privacy, whether you're a minuscule website or a vast digital giant. Or whether you're coming at it from a competition perspective, in which case you would want a differential set of rules to apply to a larger platform that already is dominant in a market that's tipped, and a bunch of smaller entrant ones. And so I think that's another sort of what's the, when you're creating those rules, those predictable rules, is the basis for them competition and leveling the playing field and entry and consumer choice, or is it some more fundamental human right? And understanding which of those you're doing takes you in different directions.
Thank you. These were fascinating presentations. Two ideas perhaps to add to what we've heard. Damien spoke about the relationship, the fraught relationship between newspapers and Google in its role of a news aggregator and conduit. And here I would like to pose a question that I've been wondering about recently, about what does it mean for a platform to curate or to govern its ecosystem? In a way, all platforms are regulators. They decide who has access to the platform. They decide what kind of activities are allowed or not allowed to the platform. They have a list of terms and conditions that explains or try to explain as clearly as possible what's okay, what's not. They have processes to take people off the platform. And as a society, more and more people are demanding two contradictory things of platforms, especially those dominant ones. One expectation we have of them, because we seem to treat them as an infrastructure or as an essential facility. We want them to be fair. We want them to give a chance to everyone to be seen. And so we project onto them a desire that we have, that they are a benevolent and fair regulator of that ecosystem. On the other hand, we are fearful that they have too much power already. And for example, civil society associations will say, we don't want YouTube to delist a video because, for example, it says bad things about a particular company. And what Google is doing here only is to cave to what the company is saying. But actually that was free speech, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that the governance of the ecosystem and the curation of platforms is something that platforms, forget regulation, they have to get that right. They don't always get that right, as we've seen with Facebook. But they should try to get that right, because otherwise they're going to lose the trust of the ecosystem members. And then if there is a competing platform that members can join, they will. And if there isn't, they will somehow later on, because that will show that there is a problem, and then investors and innovators are going to try to solve that problem. Or it will happen because the regulation authorities are going to clamp down on them. So that was the first point. The point was about we need to think more carefully about the governance of ecosystems that platforms do. The second point I want to say is, especially when we speak about newspapers, which we're going to do later on, is that there is a logic behind newspapers, which is newspapers have a voice. Newspapers stand for something. You know who's speaking, you know that you're reading a right-wing newspaper or a left-wing newspaper. And that logic of journalism is not exactly the same, or actually it's not at all the same, of a pure market-driven logic. And I think that when I hear Damien say, those who are going to own newspapers are either going to be very rich, let's put a cliche there, a very rich, Russian oligarch, or a very rich something else. And so what we are seeing, and what I think the concern is becoming, is that the logic of platforms in terms of, we're just trying to make everybody happy, we're just a neutral conduit, what do you want from us? We're not really sure who's making these curating decisions, which algorithms are making those choice decisions. What are the values there, and how transparent are we about them in an opaque AI algorithmic way? I think that's what's difficult. These different logics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Oliver?
Sure.
You have a question also to answer.
Okay, very quick. Yeah, I have questions to respond to. Yes. First of all, AdSense partnerships is the answer. To the discrepancy with the French competition authorities' findings, forgive me, I have many investigations and reports. The nuance between those two numbers, I'll have to get back to you. I'm not sure what the difference resides in. But potentially, I speak at a global level, I speak at the French level, but I'm speculating, so we should swap details and I'll clarify for you. Very, very quickly to the final point, I think that's my questions. Back to first click through. No, I'm kidding. Well, I have two observations. I think one of the things that's interesting to me listening to the panel is, on the one hand, the notion that there's something of a tension, I think, when we think about the abuse theories and the notion of the sort of unassailable positions of companies like Google. I take that point. But then on the other hand, when we talk about merger control, there's this concern that there is potential competitors out there. Jason, you referred to the Business Insider report for Instagram sort of being found in a garage. So there is, I sometimes have difficulties squaring those two. The potential competitors are there and we should be careful in merger control to ensure that they're not snuffed out. On the other hand, what does that tell us about the assailability of the positions that these companies occupy ex ante? That's an interesting question to me. My final point is to this, I think, the sort of responsibility on technological companies like Google to engage and to explain their positions and their rationales. Defaults, I think, is a very good example. How on the one hand does Google explain that in a case like Android, it takes the position that the bundles in question in that case are not tremendously effective and that users can download alternative applications, but on the other hand, Google is paying large amounts for default setting. I agree with you, there's areas where companies should engage and explain carefully the data that supports their positions. The other area where I think there is many opportunities for deeper, more fact-based engagement between companies and agencies is in the area of data, which Eustace touched on a couple of very interesting points from my perspective. How is data being used? What is the value of data? How replicable are data sets? I think there are some tremendously interesting questions there. It feels like we're at the beginning of that discussion from my perspective. Sure.
Thank you. It's been a fascinating morning. I'll just make three quick comments. One is that you don't need to get bogged down in the technicalities of the online advertising market to understand that it has torpedoed the ability of our societies to invest in original journalism. And that's a basic and fundamental point about it. The second is, and I think this picks up on your introduction, Yanis, that we don't really understand well the valuation of intangible assets, and particularly the value of data. There's far too much generalisation about data. Different kinds matter in different ways. I like Eustace's thought about data as some kinds of data as an essential facility, or perhaps there needs to be some principle that the originators of data in some sense have rights of access to it, and maybe that's something we should think about a bit more. And then finally, I agree completely with this point about market definition exercises in the conventional sense not being sufficient now. And I have a paper on this. There's a working paper version online. We need to think, I don't know whether you call it the ecosystem or the vertical architecture or whatever you call it. There needs to be a much broader kind of analysis about where value is being created and where value is being captured in these markets.
Okay, Diane already
questions as well.
mentioned that she agrees with Michael, so I follow suit and also agree that sometimes we have looked in the past, I think, at too narrow market definitions and not enough at sort of the however we call it, systems competition or the walled gardens that are being developed that actually compete. And I mean, one particular case in point that has been discussed up and down is the Google shopping case. Was this sort of an entry into the Amazon universe of some sense, or is it a market for comparison shopping sites? We don't know. But I think it is sort of there are different interpretations, and I guess that sometimes broader interpretation of who's competing with whom may make sense. The concept of relative market power, why isn't it? My understanding is that in some other jurisdictions in Europe, they are, let's say, familiar concepts, actually, but I'm not, unfortunately, a lawyer to understand enough because I'm an economist, unfortunately now in this case, to give a better answer. We will actually, now we work with Florian Bien, another lawyer from Würzburg in Germany, to enrich our report and also translate it actually, but also enrich it in also looking at some other jurisdictions that have similar concepts like the relative market power concept that is currently used. And you are completely right. Actually, it is mostly used for vertical, in some sense of vertical relations. And it is not a perfect concept, I think. Yeah, it has also its weaknesses, but I like what Andreas Mund said at the conference last week, actually, when he said we don't live in a sort of politics-free world. The alternative often may be regulation instead of further development of competition law. That's something that we see, for example, in the food industry at the moment, where we see like quite strict regulations of how to negotiate along the vertical chain. And I would actually prefer to develop competition law further instead of falling back onto regulatory intervention that is much more sort of detailed in structure how to go into the vertical chain.
And we have this regulation also in the context of the digital platforms, the business to platform regulation. So very interesting points about the abuse of economic dependence, and abuse of relative market power. Damien, final words. May you respond also to Oliver?
Yeah, so I've got three very short points, quick points. The first one is that the concerns I have expressed are not the concern of one company. They're concerns of the entire industry. They're concerns of the European Publishing Council. The media industry is, in trouble, and it is in part due to the behavior of certain platforms. Linked to that point, I would say that, for 3 years ago, I wrote a paper on Android, for example, exposing some of the conduct of Google. At the time, I was also say, oh yes, but he's representing this company, that company. Basically, I've been entirely vindicated by the European Commission. So my misunderstandings have been vindicated more than once. And in this case, I'm more than happy to be told that my data is wrong, that my ideas are confused. It takes a certain courage to basically put papers out there. And, anyone who has issues with my findings can, of course, write another paper. I think it's much better than basically doing everything in the dark. I always basically put my ideas on papers. I've produced more than 150 papers in the last 15 years. So just read it and tell me. Second point, content scraping, that was the question. It's been a concern of newspapers. It's been a concern also of other companies like Yelp, for example. I don't have the time to give you a full answer, but I suggest that you read a wonderful paper authored by Howard Shelensky about, I can't recall the title, I'm afraid, but I can find it for you if you want to. And the concept of force-free riding. This is what it is, force-free riding. So I completely agree with Howard on that point. And then the final point on online advertising, I think that, and the point that was made by someone also about the opacity and the complexity, it is really the big problem. And having spoken from some people on both the publisher side and the advertiser side, is that I was struck by their relative ignorance. They just tell me we don't know, actually. We're trying to adjust. We're trying to get the best deal for the money, right? But it's very difficult, very opaque. And here the effort I've tried to make is to try to, explain the mechanism. Now, only a competition authority can have a full view, because what you would need to get is the bidding data, and that obviously is not available. But perhaps the French competition authority will send some RFIs.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you to all speakers. It was a really interesting session. Thank you very much again. And please join me.